Violence, arrests and accusations of bribery. We'll find out why chaos has surrounded the build-up to Kenya's upcoming elections. Security is a key issue in the region. We'll examine the threat from terror group Al-Shabaab. I'm Shuli Ghosh and this is Insight. Hello there. Welcome to the programme. Violence, arrests, accusations of bribery and corruption. And there's still 3 months to go until the elections. Kenya is preparing to vote for a new president and parliament, a decade after post-election violence brought the country to the brink of civil war. A new system of government meant the 2013 poll passed relatively peacefully, but still many challenges lie ahead for a democratic Kenya. Insight's Juliana Oleinka reports.
This East African powerhouse is heading to the polls later this year. Uhuru Kenyatta, the wealthy son of the country's first president and head of the ruling Jubilee Party, has been in power for 4 years. Kenyatta is seeking a hotly contested second term. He goes up against a member of Kenya's most powerful political families, veteran politician Raila Odinga. This is the 4th time the 72-year-old former Prime Minister has been a presidential candidate. He's lost in the 2003 disputed ballot result, almost led the country into a civil war. More than 1,000 people were killed and hundreds of thousands were forced to flee their homes. With the country facing an uphill battle to curb corruption and flush out extreme terror group Al-Shabaab, there are concerns that tensions during the campaign may spiral into violence. In Kenya, politics is hard-fought, with victory mostly decided along ethnic lines. Chaotic party primaries have already led to bloody scuffles.
I and my administration are concerned that those incidents of chaos and violence that have sometimes featured in such primaries may be repeated.
To avoid much of the tension seen in the past, there has been a huge drive by the country's election commission to register millions of new voters ahead of the August ballot. There are estimates that up to 6 million people are yet to register. Crucial numbers that could swing the vote and prevent electoral fraud. The majority of the unregistered are under 25. Youth unemployment in Kenya is among the highest in East Africa. Many of them complain about being marginalized from the growing middle class.
My hopes is to improve us as youth, to give us jobs, to build the country.
I need to elect a leader who can take, many youths don't have jobs. They are jobless. Like here in Kibera, most people just, they are really struggling. Even some engage in social crimes. They end up dying because if you are caught, you are shot by the police. So I think by electing a leader, we'll be able to maybe create jobs for the youth. Yeah.
As part of his campaign, Kenyatta is doing all that he can to gain the vote from the youth. However, there are a series of other hurdles that Kenyatta will have to clear if he's to be re-elected in August. He won the 2013 elections by a narrow margin of some 800,000 votes. His alliance with Deputy President William Ruto united their respective Kikuyu and Kalenjin ethnic tribes. However, this was overshadowed by the International Criminal Court's accusations that both men incited the violence that followed. The charges against them were eventually dropped. It's yet to be determined if the various ethnic groups are as forgiving at the ballot box. To the west, Kenyatta is seen as a strong leader who has pushed back Al-Shabaab and overseen the country's economic growth. But like most countries on the continent, Kenya continues to be strangled by massive corruption, heightened political tensions and violent ethnic divisions. Observers are holding their breath, hoping for a peaceful political transition in August. Juliana Olainka, reporting for Insight.
Well, I'm joined now by Ibrahim Nye, who is a researcher and political analyst from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He's also observed elections in many African countries as an African Union observer. And also joining us from the University of Warwick is David Anderson, who is a professor of African history. During elections, most Kenyans do tend to vote along tribal lines. How problematic has that been in Kenya's history?
Well, it is becoming more and more of a problem in the last 20 years or so. Every election since the 1990s has seen very severe patterns of ethnic voting, and especially in urban areas where people are settled in segregated zones, and in remote rural areas where people don't have much contact with other ethnic groups. Sometimes this has resulted, as in the case of 2007, in quite serious violence. And the violence that took place at that election was organised on ethnic lines. But the origins of this really stems from the 1990s, when the regime of President Daniel Arap Moi organised ethnic voting.
And Ibrahim, I mean, the primaries so far have been pretty chaotic. Parties have struggled with logistics. There's been violence in some areas. Part of that, critics say, is because political parties in Kenya have very weak internal structures because they rely so heavily on ethnic loyalties, people voting for their candidates, whatever the policies.
Well, what we've seen in Kenya over the last few years is that parties do not necessarily exist as structures. They rally around personalities, and then the personalities will mobilize the institutions that support them. So you've seen more than 5 parties over the last few years coming together for the same individuals. They recycle. So you will understand that Kenyatta and Odinga have dominated since Mwai Kibaki. Kenyatta and Odinga continue to dominate the politics. And they mobilize support based on their personalities and their ethnicity. So wherever they go, that's where the strength is. So it's not about the political institutions. Now you see Kenyatta now is the Jubilee Alliance Party, and Odinga is the National Support Alliance.
And this is the alliance of parties which has helped to promote political stability in Kenya, this Jubilee Alliance Party, which has relatively saw the 2013 elections go off with much less violence than before. Is that correct?
Yes, somehow, because they try to mobilize and they try to benefit from the ethnic cleavages somehow. From one person from one ethnic group try to get a running mate from another ethnic group. So in that way, it's a kind of incentive that helped to stabilize the ethnic tension. But notwithstanding, it's still very clear that the voters in Kenya will continue to support the lead candidate of their ethnicity.
David, Kenyatta, of course, running to win the seat again. This is a man who was blamed by various parties for the violence in the 2007 election. The ICC dropped the charges, but how has that impacted on Kenyatta and his running mate, William Ruto?
Well, Kenyatta has faced a considerable problem through his alliance with Ruto. But he's had to deal with that problem because the way in which Kenya's political system is configured, he needs to win seats across a number of different regions in order to secure the presidency. So Kenya's political coalitions are actually mathematical calculations of what it will take to buy a winning ticket. Now, Kenyatta's problem is that if he loses Ruto as an ally, he will struggle to replace him with someone who could bring the same number of votes in the right areas. So I think Kenyatta has no real love for Ruto, but he is stuck with him. And my feeling has always been that Kenyatta would have been mightily relieved had the ICC convicted Ruto, as that would have removed him from the scene and might have allowed Kenyatta an opportunity to make an alliance with a different leader from Ruto's Kalenjin group in the Rift Valley.
So you're saying he's stuck with Ruto and that might not necessarily benefit him in the upcoming election?
I think it's a challenge for him, because Ruto has policies and attitudes that Kenyatta doesn't necessarily accept or endorse. And overall, Ruto is much more in favor of devolution and devolved powers, whereas Kenyatta would rather keep more authority at the center of government. And this has considerable relevance in Kenya's current constitution, which has created a new level of county administrations, where Ruto has been quite successful in gaining support from some of the senior and emergent politicians at the county level.
Well, let's talk about those changes. David mentions the new county assemblies that were created in the 2010 constitution. This is a new system of government in Kenya, and with the creation of these county seats. How has that affected the way voting goes in Kenya?
Well, first, let's say that the decentralization or devolution in Kenya has given opportunity for emerging actors out of the national stage to participate in the politics. So that is somehow a stabilizing force in Kenya. And you find out that actors that were once competing at the national stage have all gone back to their counties to compete. So the competition is not as fierce as it would have been at the national level. But the current level of politics at the county administration, one is about the question of corruption that has been devolved from the national level to the local level as well. But interestingly, the Constitution of Kenya, the 47 counties, the division it has provided is in a way that you have to make sure to win at least 25% of votes in half of those regions. So it's going to be very significant to this election. And how Kenyatta or Odinga manages the local politicians, who to some extent are becoming very powerful in their local areas, is another question for this election. Okay,
let me quickly put that question of corruption to David, because this is a big issue for the government in Kenya. The last election, Kenyatta won by a minuscule amount, 0.07%, and was dogged by claims of fraud. How big a problem is this for democratic elections in Kenya?
I think it's an enormous problem. Not only are there issues of how the elections are administered and whether they can be shown to be free and fair, but there's also the challenge that the county structures appears to be changing the way that certain groups are voting and aligning. In the last election, people were unsure how important the counties would be. But this time it looks as if lots of very senior politicians have decided that they would be better off moving towards the county system and becoming county senators, county governors, rather than staying in the national system. And that means that the capacity of central government, of Kenyatta's administration, to control these politicians is more limited and constrained. So managing politics has become much more challenging for the ruling party. And I think it's noticeable that in the primaries, a lot of the trouble and violence that you mentioned earlier has occurred in counties where there is dispute about the nomination of candidates. In other words, local electors are rejecting the people that the coalition parties would like to put forward, and are instead promoting others. So that kind of dissent, I think, illustrates how difficult it is to manage this situation.
OK, gentlemen, for the moment, thank you very much indeed for that. David Ibrahim, I'll be speaking to you after the break. You're watching Insight. And coming up, we'll be taking a look at the threat from terror group Al-Shabaab in the region. Stay with us.